It's encouraging to me that people are still excited about this textbook.
Rita Schenck is so well known in the LCA community, perhaps she doesn't need an introduction. She's worked in LCA for several decades. She represented the U.S. in the development of the ISO LCA standards in the 1990s. Dr. Schenck is trained as an oceanographer with focus on ecotoxicology and biogeochemistry. After organizing and coordinating the American Center for LCA for nearly 15 years, she currently directs the Institute for Environmental Research and Education, and she co-edited the textbook Environmental Life Cycle Assessment, which is the subject of this webinar.
And happy to introduce my co-presenter and co-editor, Philip White, who is a designer and a longtime practitioner of LCA. Does wonderful designs and wins all kinds of prizes for them. He's also an engineer and has several patents for his work, and has been a dream to work with on this and other projects for ACLCA. Currently, he teaches at the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University, and has developed a design tool called Ocala, which is used by many design professionals to get life cycle thinking into their decision making.
So, as Rita mentioned, this webinar reviews the textbook in Environmental Life Cycle Assessment. In this webinar, we'll review the textbook, and we'll look at how the book can be used to learn about LCA in different contexts. It can be used in classes that are for credit at a college or university. It can be used by professionals or individuals as a self-guided learning tool. After that, we'll cover 5 sections of the textbook, focusing on selected content from each chapter. We'll include illustrating the central topic of this chapter, and we'll give a few examples, problem examples from each chapter as well. This is an overview of the content. We organized it together in 5 sections. There's contextual LCA information, lifecycle inventory, impact assessment, interpretation of results, LCA management, and reporting.
I want to give you a little bit of background here about where this textbook came from. Way back in 2011, Philip and I were talking about the need for a college-level LCA textbook. There really wasn't anything available, and we thought it was really essential to have something out that will help teachers to bring their students up to speed rapidly in this field. So that's where it came from. We have a whole new generation of LCA professionals that we hope are aided by this book. However, the authors of this textbook, we decided that it would make much more sense to have experts on all the different aspects of LCA rather than having just Philip and me write the textbook. We could have done it, but we thought it would be much more interesting to have the real experts and experienced people in the field who are focusing on different items to talk about what they know about it, so that we got the best and the brightest working on this and not just a couple of brains.
As Rita noted, this textbook can be used in a variety of different contexts. We can use it to support traditional college-level courses, and that the course could be a fully dedicated course that addresses only life cycle assessment, or it could include LCA as part of another topic, such as environmental management. If the course allows sufficient time, each chapter can be studied in sequence, the sequence that's given in the textbook. This would give quite a thorough introduction of this complex topic. Another way of using the textbook, which in my observation is how it is usually used, is for the instructor to review all of the content and select which chapters to include in the course, and then decide what sequence works best for the course and for the students in the course. There are many reasons why you may decide to do this, including the amount of time that is available, the need to incorporate other subjects or projects, and the particular needs of the student body. One of the beauties of this textbook is that you can use it in a wide range of circumstances, and it's essential for the instructor to review the chapters before they assign the chapters.
Yeah, one of the things that really surprised us was how many early sales we got in this textbook for professionals working in the field, particularly people working in businesses rather than consultants. The feedback we got was that it was really useful for them to catch on to the things that they hadn't quite got a handle on in their practice, and to get a deeper understanding of their LCA work. So I'm glad we found a use there as well. Clearly, we worked really hard to make sure that the language of the textbook was very standard English and was not too techy, so that although it was very clear what was being said and it covered all the technical aspects, the challenge for us was to get all the language from all these different authors to be sort of on the same level and easy to understand. We have a couple of questions here that we hope that you can answer for us, to help us with any modifications or assistance in this textbook, and so we have a little set of questions here. Debbie Steckel is taking care of this with a poll. Debbie, can you put up the poll? Give everybody a couple minutes here. So Debbie, can you close this poll down there and tell us what people said? It would be nice to know who was on board today, and whether they're doing college level courses or working on their own.
Yeah, great. So it looks like 25% said a college level course, 75% said studying while working at a job. So
awesome.
So do you want to go to the next question about if you answered A?
Yeah. So what happened with answers of A?
Let's see, I just posted that part of it now. Give about 30 seconds. Thank you all for voting so quickly. Okay, so it looks like 39% said cover all chapters in sequence, and 61% said cover selected chapters in different sequence. For those of you who answered question B, put up the following poll. Wow, and this one, 100% have said study on your own.
Oh, that's interesting. A couple of the chapters were written by groups working in a company. So we kind of thought maybe that was common, but I guess there's an awful lot of practitioners sort of all on their lonesome doing their work. So, okay, so close this and move on. All right, so now we're going to talk about the content of the textbook. We have these different categories that are pretty much in order, but there was upfront contextual information that was not a how-to, but background for people, and we'll talk about those chapters first. The first 3 chapters were contextual, so there was kind of the framework, this is what LCA is. Second, the international standards, which are kind of the constitution of LCA, and finally, ethics in LCA. So you should, I think, all be familiar with this. How people are looking at this kind of thing. These are standard descriptions of how LCA is done.
Yeah, and we begin from the assumption that the students have no experience with LCA, so we try to
Right.
clearly appropriate for novices in the field. And we also included the definitions of the LCA and ISO framework. We outlined common LCA concepts with how and make comparisons between LCA and other environmental impact measurement methods. The ubiquity of energy in most ways that the LCA is most frequently used in practice. So keep going, Rita.
Okay.
I've this, and so I think we go to the next.
So, anything else you want to say? Philip, you're one of the authors of this chapter.
Well, as I said, that we cover these central themes, the characteristics of LCA, and what they and define the different terminologies that they mean, or that are used in LCA. So,
okay.
We'll cover this.
Our second chapter was on the ISO standards, and we were lucky enough to get Matthias Finkbeiner from University of Tübingen to write this chapter. Matthias has been the chair of the TC207 chapter or committee on LCA for more than a decade, and has great historical knowledge and, of course, total technical understanding of what it is. And an interesting thing has happened since this textbook was written. The standards were up for review. They're reviewed every 5 years. And in this case, both the standards for LCA, ISO 14040, 44, and so forth, those standards were up for review and nothing was changed. And in addition, the EPD standards were also up. The EPD standard was also up for review, and it also was unchanged. And that's good. That means that our textbook is still accurate. So I'm very pleased with that. Then Chapter 3 is about ethics. Ethics is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm not an ethicist, but I found somebody who was to be a co-chairman with me. But I have reviewed, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of LCA studies, and I find very often that people are making ethical errors in their studies, and they're not. It's not like they're trying to be dishonest or something. It's just they don't understand the topic of ethics and what their responsibilities are. What does it mean to have due care? How to think about ethics. Some of the questions we have in the textbook try to get students to think about these sorts of things. So questions about broad claims made as a result of doing LCA studies, and what you should do about that. How do you make your client understand what kinds of claims can be made and so forth. What exactly you should be paying attention to in LCA. What are the things in LCA that really matter? So for example, you know, obviously if people are making decisions based on LCA and there's uncertainty in the results, then it's important that people know about that uncertainty and that they don't make a decision which could have potentially negative outcomes for the environment. And LCA is, of course, a very complicated study, and so it's important as professionals that we be as transparent and honest as possible, so that people who are not experts can use the results. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what the ethics chapter is about. So questions. Now's the time. Debbie, do we have any questions in?
We do have a question in. Okay, the question is, I'm doing research on bioenergy using SEMA Pro. So is there related content on how to use LCA software?
How to use LCA software?
Well,
You mean I guess this question is about the practical use of LCA, of the tools. And that actually is not part of this textbook. That's sort of a practicum. We assume that people will, if they're in college, for example, will have some kind of a laboratory class where they're off learning that sort of thing. It's not part of this textbook.
It's software.
Yeah, the software providers should be helping you there.
Great, and we have one other question. What is deep ecology?
Deep ecology is an ethical stance which says that the environment has value in and of itself that is very important and that we as ethical individuals should protect. So taken to an extreme, you have the tree huggers that are, like not allowing people to log. I'm not suggesting that that kind of thing is a good thing, but that's the philosophy behind that approach. Deep ecology is something that has led to the development of national parks, for example. It's fundamentally a stance that says the environment itself, our natural environment, has value in and of itself, independent of any economic benefit to human beings. That's deep ecology.
Great, that's all the questions we have right now.
Okay.
So our next section is on life cycle inventory, and we have 5 chapters here: unit processes, life cycle inventory, data quality, economic input-output LCA, and advanced system modeling. So this chapter introduces the most basic of data in LCA, which is the unit process. It describes in detail the unit process, how it is used to model outputs, and how it is expressed mathematically. It introduces the basic concept of elementary flows that come from the ecosphere and intermediate flows that come from the technosphere. A central message is the need for thorough and consistent approaches when collecting and reporting unit process data. The next chapter, as we see here in this example, we see how unit processes can be combined to make another unit process. So another unit process, so it's a little bit like the Russian dolls. You can build up levels of information and repackage them to unit processes that can be very useful in the LCA process. Here we see the example of electricity production from coal, natural gas, and wind energy.
Then we had our next chapter, going past those basics, was about life cycle inventory, which covers concepts such as a system function and functional unit, inventory modeling, the computational structure of life cycle assessment, inventory calculations, really down and dirty questions like how do you select your LCI data, what matters and what doesn't, and how to streamline that. One of the interesting things happening in this book was at this time, my organization had, at the time this book was written, my organization had gathered a whole bunch of information about beer. We have done more beer LCAs than you can shake a stick at. And we were able to share that data with all of the authors so that the theme of beer production has gone throughout the book and helps kind of hold it all together with the different authors. It's also kind of fun to think about instead of electricity production or some other similar kind of product.
We actually had a couple of, we had refrigerators, beer, and I think roofing were 3 example products that we use repetitively throughout the book.
Right. Having full unit process data, and a lot of it really made it possible for people to use that data and illustrate the chapters. And so this is an example of aluminum production that could be used for making beer cans. As it turns out, when you look at all the different kinds of packaging for beer at retail, and cans have the lowest environmental impact. An interesting item. So, data quality. Hugely important in life cycle assessment, and this chapter is devoted to it. And it really has people learn about data quality, how they can assure it, critical review importance, and a bunch of exercises. So the concept of the pedigree matrix, and what it can do and what it can't do. And you know, and this is really in the guts of, I have all this LCI data in my SEMA Pro or my Gavi software, and which one should I use? And as everybody knows, you never have a perfect set of primary data for LCA. So learning what's important and what the limitations are is really, really important concept, which is embedded in this chapter.
The method known as economic input-output LCA is covered in Chapter 7. This approach to LCA is very different than process LCA. Economic input-output LCA makes a correlation between the economic exchanges between sectors in a national economy and the emissions from each market sector. Here's a table, it's a generic table of input and outputs. Inputs and outputs that can be extrapolated to a much larger set of data representing sectors in the national economy. Yeah, it's the basic methodology. We define all the terms and nomenclature, as well as describe the methods to combine economic input-output methods with process LCA. In Chapter 8, we discuss several LCA approaches that are critical for day-to-day LCA practice. These include consequential LCA, which expands the system boundary to include selected economic relationships. Consequential LCA, or actually, ways of allocating impacts from processes with multiple outputs, which is known as allocation, or multifunctionality, and various methods of dealing with material recycling in LCA. Here are some examples of a few of the problem exercises in the chapter that give an opportunity to apply attributional. The first compares, the first models hydrogen-powered automobiles, and the second one looks at 2 uses of orange peels. As with all the problem exercises in the book, the answers are given.
Okay. We are at a resting point. Does anyone have questions here about this sort of nuts and bolts piece of the textbook?
Great. Let's see. The first question here is, would you please explain about the computational structure of LCI calculations?
Do you want to take that, Philip, or you want me to?
Why don't you take it?
Okay, so there's two different ways to calculate LCIs. One is using matrix algebra, which just has a matrix of all of the flows and all of the unit processes and how much of each you got. And you calculate that way. And that's the basis of the calculations behind Zima Pro and a bunch of other software. The other way to do it is through iterative flow analysis, which is the basis of GABI. Now, I want to say that the results from these two different mathematical approaches are pretty much identical. So it's, two different paths to getting the same way. So, but you need to understand what those two different paths are, and that's what that chapter talks about.
Great. And we have one other question right now, which is, what type of examples or exercises are given for Chapter 7, Economic?
Oh, economic input output. Yeah, we just gave an example of. Let's see. Well, if you
we have one here.
No, back up one more. Oh, let's see. Well, we'd have to look that up, which we can, but I think we probably don't have time to select appropriate ones. But for each of the chapters, we have problem exercises with answers.
Right. So I'm sorry, I can't think of any right now myself. But so for example, I'm sure that there were some questions about the limitations of EIO, LCA. One of them being that that's based on national economic flows, not international flows. And although there's some efforts ongoing to change that, to get more global approach between countries, right now, EIO is really only legitimate within a country.
Great, and we have one.
That's an example.
But I think it's also the chapter touches on hybrid methods that combine process and economic input output, which try to fill in those international gaps.
Right, and so, well, certainly all input output analyses are fundamentally based on process flow analysis, which has been done. So the basic standard old LCI data gathering is behind EIO. It's just much abstracted.
Great, and we have one other question. Is there any information regarding the dynamic approach?
You know, there's some discussion of the dynamic approach in later chapters. It's definitely research oriented. I'm not familiar with anybody that's doing it in real time now. I have myself developed tools to do that, but so far I haven't gotten anybody to stand up and say, please come do it with me. So we'll see what happens. Okay. So our next set of chapters was about impact assessment, and I got to write the chapter on natural science, I think, because there's really very few natural scientists in the LCA world. I wish that would change, because I find often that that the interpretation of LCA is limited by people not understanding actually what impacts are, what causes the impacts, what matters and what doesn't. what's the endpoints for the impacts. People truly don't understand the natural science. And I think that the field as a whole would be much stronger if we got more natural scientists working in it. So in one chapter, we covered natural science and LCA, land, ocean, and atmosphere, chemistry, the water cycle, ecology, important environmental science concepts, and environmental mechanisms, all in one chapter. So this is one of the most compressed chapters in the book, I think.
And I really want to add, in my opinion, this is the most captivating chapter in the entire textbook. So if you do not have time to use all of the chapters that are in the textbook in your course, please make sure that you include this chapter because it is extremely informative and educational.
Thanks, Philip. It's nice of you to say that. Part of this chapter talks about biology because fundamentally, if we're worried about environmental impacts, we're not talking about impacts for rocks. We're talking about impacts on organisms. This is sort of a concept that's embedded in deep ecology. If you look on this phylogenetic tree way over to the right, you can see how small human beings are. They're not even listed here in this tree of life for the world. So part of deep ecology is saying, look how small we are. There's millions of other species that have a right to be here too. So chapter 10 talks about impact assessment and modeling. So this is really what are the models? This is trying to take from a natural science and move on to how do we model that natural science in LCA and not in LCA. It tries to give people some practical knowledge about environmental sampling and measurement methods. I did spend an early part of my career capturing water samples of all sorts and doing strange things to them in the lab. And as a result of that, I got a huge, very deep understanding of the variability in nature, which is much, much larger than we think about it when we talk about LCA. And of course, if real variability is large, what we can say about impacts is small. Anyway, it's an important concept. So fate and transport models, we need to understand how scientists model the world in order for us to understand the limitations and what we actually can learn from the natural science. And certainly toxicology is probably the part of natural science and of impact assessment that people understand the least and argue about the most. Then in chapter 11.
Yeah, in chapter 11, it covers the critical topic of life cycle impact assessment. In this phase, life cycle inventory data are grouped into categories and mathematically converted into the environmental and human health impact in the process that is called characterization. Here's a diagram that shows some of the typical emissions, impact categories, midpoint and endpoint categories, and the areas of protection. It gives an idea of the complexity and the scientific density of these methods. And here's, in this chapter that was written by Tom Gloria, we have a detailed description of how these common impact categories are modeled in Tracy, which is from the US EPA, and from the Product Environmental Footprint from the European Commission. And these methods are described in detail, including the fate and transport models, etc. So covering these fairly typical categories that can be in life cycle assessments. Here's a couple of the exercises from chapter 11, asking about use talks and how it is structured. Another question about the differences between midpoint and endpoint methods, which is critical to understand in general about LCIA. So again, these are some examples of the kinds of problem examples that we have in the textbook. In the next chapter, we have parallel LCA methods. So several methods analyze product systems over their life cycles, but evaluate other phenomena than environmental quality. This chapter describes these methods. So life cycle costing originated decades before LCA. It models economic cost over the entire life cycle. Social LCA also uses the life cycle to model the social characteristics of a product system. And lastly, the method known as life cycle sustainability assessment is discussed. It combines all three of the methods together: life cycle costing, social LCA, and environmental LCA. And you see a diagram about that.
So again, a little break for questions.
Great. I see one question. Why do the biologists claim they are in the queen science?
In the clean science?
I'm sorry, queen, Q-U-E-E-N.
Okay, so biologists don't claim that. I said that about chemistry. And the reason why is that chemistry is at the center of almost all natural sciences. You cannot understand, nuclear physics if you don't understand chemistry. You sure can't understand biology if you don't know chemistry. You don't understand life cycle assessment if you don't know chemistry. So that was just me calling it the queen science. Sorry for the confusion. I do have kind of a quirky sense of humor.
Okay, it says biologists, there's just one other, I think it may be more of a comment. Biologists claim that they are the most important for sustainability. They say they are the center. I agree with Rita. And that's all we have right now.
Okay. Okay.
Our next section covers interpretation of results, which includes decision support calculations, interpretation, application of statistics, understanding of bias and uncertainty. These are all things that are an essential part of life cycle assessment practice. Chapter 12 covers a range of optional calculations that can be performed to better understand LCIA results. And these include grouping, midpoint calculations, normalization, weighting, endpoint calculations, and multi-criteria aggregation methods. I co-authored this chapter with Bengt Steen. He's been working in this field since the 70s, and for me, it was very interesting to work with him to get his historical perspective on all of this. In terms, for instance, that the endpoint calculations, of which they call damage assessment, always integrate weighting as part of their the methodology, while in more modern, in my opinion, more recent methodologies, weighting is seen as an optional step which you can add or not add depending on what you're doing. We also touched upon multi-criteria aggregation procedures because there's interest in some practitioners about that. When we wrote the chapter, we made sure to include for each calculation method a clear example of the application and describe the situations where it may be most usefully applied. So we did that for each of the different calculation methods that we addressed in the chapter. Next is a problem, or some examples of problem exercises. What I have found in teaching this subject of LCA is that requiring students to perform basic calculations, for instance, such as normalization by hand, is for most of the students, the best way to teach them the concepts, as opposed to just writing on the board, showing some equations, because when students do it by hand, they're forced to understand what it means. And so these exercises are really essential in the learning process.
So our next chapter was written by Sean Hunter and Rich Howling at Dow. They have a huge amount of experience of trying to explain LCA results to business managers. So I thought what they had to say was very useful. So it's a lot of discussion about contribution analysis, cutoff rules, sensitivity analysis, and how to express conclusions and limitations and recommendations. So, you know, the interpretation they're quite well aware is truly variable. It's all over, depending on who you want to talk to, and how robust the data has to be to support results. And so they make, they do a lot of graphic representation of what's going on. And as you all know, you have to practically cross your eyes in order to see some of these results for different impact categories for different products. So how you interpret it is important. I wish we had actually more pictures from it because they had great pictures in this chapter. Then there was this wonderful chapter on statistics. When I was in grad school, we used to call this sadistics. It was so painful taking statistics courses. But here's what we need to tell people. It's complicated, and there's uncertainty in the results. And it's possible to make statistical inferences based on having enough data. So, as I mentioned before, we had great beer data, and it was possible to do calculations of environmental impacts of different beers and different producers. And here's what we found. They're all pretty much alike. When you look at this data, here we have it's on a log 10 basis, but there's a huge range looking at the data. And what that means is that it's very difficult to make a statement that one beer is better than another from an environmental perspective. Wide range of data. And in chapter...
Yeah, chapter
50,
2.
Yeah.
Yeah, it explores bias and uncertainty in LCA. And as I have mentioned, uncertainty is mentioned in the earlier chapters because it's so important in LCA. This chapter focuses on, in particular, these terms are defined and the sources of these, the sources of bias and uncertainty are identified, for which uncertainty has many potential sources. And it also discusses methods to eliminate or minimize each of these sources of inaccuracy.
So another stop for questions. Q&A time.
Yeah, I don't see any
I would
questions.
say that, yeah, I just like to comment about bias and uncertainty is that most people don't recognize that they have bias. It's hard to see in yourself. And so it's a really good reason to do LCA studies in teams and to have outside reviews, at least for anything where you're going to make any kind of marketing statement.
Great. Well, we have one question. In sensitivity analysis, what is the meaning of those percentages?
sensitivity analysis.
Could they mention which diagram they're talking about?
No, I can ask.
Okay, what we can talk about sensitivity analysis. It's the role of a sensitivity analysis is to see to what degree output results calculations are a function of inputs, of different inputs. So since we have uncertainty in our inputs, if we can say this is our number plus or minus 50%, what does that mean? So plus or minus 50% for the use of electricity, for example. What does that mean in terms of the output, in terms of climate change and toxicity or whatever else you're measuring in your LCA? That's what a sensitivity analysis does. And they're typically done on a percentage basis, plus or minus 15% is very common. 50%. So that's a pretty reasonable estimate of variability in processes. Hopefully that answered the question. All right, so all of this work has to be distilled in such a way that it can be interpreted properly by people who are not experts. Part of that work is in managing the work, making sure that it's reproducible. And part of it is in talking about it. How do you talk about it? What is legitimate to say and what is not? So here's another example. We had a team from DuPont writing this chapter. And they had Gantt charts, and they had an amazing detail on project management for LCA. In fact, I had to keep saying, all right, it's not an entire book on project management. They were quite impressive as a team, though. And one of the things that they kept saying over and over again, which I thought was fairly amusing, is that it's iterative. You do it over and over again. So they were being iterative in their textbook chapter. But they're absolutely right that it's important to have multiple eyes looking at each calculation, and that it is an iterative process. You find something out, and it changes how you're doing it. So a lot of useful graphs and charts to help people manage their project and get it done in a timely and cost-effective fashion.
Chapter 18 describes communication best practices. And this chapter can be applied to a wide variety of phenomena. Basically, it can be applied anywhere where you're communicating to anyone, especially a group. And so it's a very useful chapter. It also covers the reporting of requirements for ISO 1440, and these include third-party reports, executive summaries, and so forth, all the details that are listed in ISO 1444. And so those are all covered. If you apply these practices, such as communicating significance and telling a story, and so forth, this will increase the understanding of the study by the audience of the assessment. So it's really helpful. What often happens is scientifically oriented people do LCAs who are not necessarily good communicators. And so this is a very helpful chapter in that regard.
And then chapter 19 was making LCA-based product claims, particularly environmental product declarations, but also type 1 eco-labels. So clearly there's a lot of good stuff that you can claim once you can back it up with an LCA. The most popular thing lately, I think, is the environmental product declarations. That's being driven by a lot of different things, but certainly in the building industry, construction industry, by the U.S. Green Building Council. This is an example of environmental product declaration for beer that my organization produced, and it's quite exciting to me that we can finally get a whole bunch of the facts together, since that's the mission of my organization. But they have to be, APDs have to be produced very carefully. It's important to be as accurate as possible. I have some pet peeves. For example, I think if you have more than 2 significant figures, you're misleading people into the precision of your results. But in any event, I see the use of these exploding. In fact, our website has almost 6,000 EPDs on it. So the importance of understanding LCA, it can't be minimized, and the opportunity for using LCA to drive both sales and improvement in the environment also can't be minimized. So aside from that, here's some information about where to get the book and what it costs. We tried doing electronic version, but we have so many images in our textbook that it really didn't work out very well to have electronic version. So we were stuck with printed books, which you can get through Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or directly from ACLCA. Cheaper if you get it through ACLCA, at least if you're a member. And it's especially a good deal for students because they get ACLCA membership is included in the purchase of their book.
It's a great deal for students.
It's a great deal. And now we have some questions for you. Debbie, we're going to put up the... Oops.
Yep. Okay, I will get the poll up.
The poll.
Here we go. Okay, I'm closing the poll. Can everyone see the results, or should I read them?
Would you read them, please?
Sure. 56% said within the next month, 19% said within the next year, and 25% said they do not plan to purchase the textbook.
Okay. Well, that's really good feedback for us. Thanks for answering that, everyone. Last chance for questions.
Okay, let's see. How do you expect the new administration's efforts to downplay climate change will impact the field of LCA and the mid to long-term prospects for the field? I guess that's not very targeted to the textbook, but.
Yeah. Okay, this is an example of where this is my opinion, not ACLCA's opinion. I think I think that the concern or lack of concern for climate change is like a keynote for the new administration. Just the other day, I heard that they're dropping EPA's funding by 30%. However, despite their clear lack of interest in environmental issues, at least when I talk to my colleagues in business, they say sustainability and life cycle assessment to support their claims for sustainability is not going away. It's not driven by the government, and in fact, the EPA never has once come out with a policy statement that LCA is a good thing. So it's hard to predict what's going to go on. I'm sure there'll be some people who will just say, I don't have to worry about the environment, and therefore I don't have to worry about LCA. But I think there's just as many people who are saying, being able to prove your efforts towards sustainability is important, and it is a marketing tool. So kind of meta. I'm not sure which way it's going to go, but my gut feeling is it's not going to make much difference.
Great, and we have 2 other questions right now, both related to the textbook. Will it be sufficient to prepare for the LCACP exam with the textbook?
We designed the textbook with the objective of preparing you for the LCACP exam. So if you can successfully answer all of the questions in all of the chapters, then you should be well prepared for that exam.
The only other thing is that there's a prerequisite to take the exam, and that prerequisite is that you have had some actual real LCA experience that you can document. That can be achieved through classroom laboratory work, or it could be an internship, or it could be your job. It has to be documented. So yeah, a real driver for this textbook was that we would have everything in it that's required for the exam. That's where it is.
Great. We have another question that has 2 parts to it. The first is, could you tell us more about the exam for hopeful LCA practitioners? And then the second part is, and what are the job opportunities for LCA practitioners, and where can they apply?
I think we can take on the question about the exam. The exam is a 3.5-hour exam. There's 184 multiple choice questions. They change year by year, and it's kind of a stressful exam to take. The exam is given at the conference. Is it planned again this year, Debbie?
Yes, it is. And that would be on October 2nd.
Also, yeah. And we're planning also on offering it in Costa Rica in May, I think.
In Spanish.
And in addition, it can be taken anywhere in the world by developing a proctor. That is somebody who's there to make sure that you are you and you're not using aids. This is a closed book exam. So all of those can be arranged through ACLCA.
So Rita, is the Costa Rican exam going to be in Spanish?
That's the plan.
See?
Great.
Aren't some jobs posted on the ACLCA website?
Yes, and in our newsletter. And then I know there is an LCA listserv that also often lists job opportunities.
Any more questions then?
Yeah, that looks like the last of the questions.
Right on time.
That's
Right.
perfect.
Yeah, thanks everybody for staying with us and listening to this. We really appreciate your attention. I'm sure Philip feels the same as I do. I'd be happy to talk to anybody and contact me via email.
Yeah, as well. Thank you so much.